Well, I always thought Chuck Schumer had a little left in him, that is left leaning. Um, he may just be a communist. Why do I say that? Stay tuned. Hi, my name's Dr. Ken Henry, and this is Conservative Commentary, where we spread the MAGA message. Hey, before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a favor. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. These things really help us grow the channel. And go over to youtube.com/@themagamessage and check out our other videos. The address is in the bottom right. Now, let's talk about Chucky. I sometimes wonder about Chuck's mental acuity as well as some of the others in D.C. But recent photos have been released of Chuck dancing on stage with a member of the Chinese Communist Party, all decked out in Chinese garb. Oh, and guess who was with him? The porcine prosecutor, Alvin Bragg, was also with him. What in the world are these people thinking? They're at some Chinese celebration in New York City. I understand that, but to put on the Chinese garb and to be seen with a known member of the Chinese Communist Party, that's certainly the wrong optics, particularly in this political time when the data that have recently been released show that Republicans actually hold an edge now over Democrats in registrations. Wow, that's a turnaround. But then you've got Chucky out dancing in the streets with members of the Chinese Communist Party. Oh, my word. What is this world coming to? Sir Chuckster and the Chinese Communist Party. And there's no wonder that the registrations are changing. Trump's winning it left and right, and you have these Democrats doing this crazy stuff. Take a look at the following clip, and please share your thoughts in the comments.
China's investment in the Caribbean is greater per capita than it is in Latin America. And the Caribbean is resource poor. There's very little there that the Chinese would want, except, of course, the Caribbean is called America's third border. And I think the Chinese are trying to gain influence in a region which is very close to the American homeland. So if you look at the Bahamas, for instance, there the Chinese have two very large projects. There's the Baha Mar Hotel, 2.5 billion, and the Freeport Container Port, which is about 3.4 billion. So that's 5.9 billion in a very small island chain. And the question is, well, why would they do that? Well, the Freeport Container Port is 87 miles east of Palm Beach, Florida. And it may not be financially viable. That means the Chinese could very well take it over, which means the Chinese could have a naval base 87 miles east of Palm Beach. And that has got us thinking about what we can do to counter Beijing in an area very close to our shores. The Trump administration is reviewing USAID. And I think generally that's good. But putting a pause on all foreign aid is certainly going to undermine America's relationships with Caribbean states. And so I hope that pause is lifted for projects which really do materially advance America's standing in the region. But this is also a replay of what's going on in Panama. In Panama, President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio have correctly said that China has inordinate control over the canal zone. And part of that is because Hutchison operates ports at both ends of the canal, at Cristobal on the Atlantic side and at Balboa on the Pacific side. And those port operations give the Chinese military one of the ways to close down the canal in a time of war. Well, Hutchison also operates the Freeport Container Port. And so here we have got something that we can do. Example, in Panama, Hutchison's franchise to those two ports was renewed in 2021 for 25 years. And so we would normally think Hutchison is there for a long time to stay. But the problem is that that renewal was no bid. And so Panama is now under pressure from the US to reconsider rebidding those port facilities. And this is something that I think that we can think about with regard to the Bahamas. Freeport has not been an inordinate success, and maybe there's some way to pressure the Bahamas to rebid that Freeport because we want American port operators there, especially in a place so close to our shores. President Trump has this really interesting argument with President Molino of Panama over the presence of Chinese soldiers. Now, there are no uniformed Chinese soldiers in the canal zone. But that's not the end of the story because I'm sure that they are Chinese soldiers as well as Ministry of State Security agents and operatives in the canal zone because everybody knows that the Chinese, if they want to, can close down the canal. And matter of fact, that could be one of the first indications that China intends to use force in East Asia because they'll close down the canal to prevent the US Navy from surging ships and submarines from the Atlantic Fleet to the Pacific Fleet. So the first indication that there will be a war in East Asia could very well be a quote unquote accident in the Panama Canal. And so clearly we've got to do something. Yes, China doesn't operate the canal technically, but China is extremely influential in the canal zone, probably more influential than we are. And that's also true of Panama in general. So the United States needs to start thinking about how do we get our businesses, how do we get our port operators, how do we get our institutions into the canal zone and Panama to replace those from China? This is going to take some time because China didn't take over the canal zone with soldiers. They took it over with people in business attire with large checkbooks and suitcases of cash. And the United States needs to come in with cash of its own to drive the Chinese out of the canal zone and Panama. But we can see what China's doing in the Caribbean. It is trying to crowd Taiwan out, and it's also trying to threaten the United States. So we have a legitimate interest in trying to get the Chinese out of this region. We want the United States to be secure. And if we want to start thinking about this in historical terms, we should look at the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis because China right now is taking over Russian listening posts in Cuba. And we need to make sure that Cuba is not used as a base for an attack on the US. That's sort of, far-fetched for most people. But we got to remember that China right now is surveilling US telecommunications traffic from Cuba. And we also know that Cuban operatives with Chinese support are operating in our country. So there's a lot going on there that we need to counter. We have not paid attention to the Western Hemisphere. You'd have to go back to the first part of the 20th century to see an American president who was primarily focused on countries closest to us. What is fascinating about Secretary Rubio's first foreign trip as America's top diplomat is that he didn't go to Europe, he didn't go to Asia or the Middle East. He chose to stay in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that that shows that President Trump's foreign policy, at least initially, will be focused on North and South America. That's a good thing. That's the first time in more than a century that an American president has given his primary principal focus to countries closest to the United States. Jimmy Carter, as president, thought that America's possession of the canal zone created ill will, not only in Panama, but in Latin America generally. And he felt that if the United States left, that that would create goodwill. I think that might have been a little bit naive, but the point is, with those two Panama Canal treaties, I mean, he left, and that allowed a big vacuum. After the Cold War, we Americans thought that history had ended, as political scientist Francis Fukuyama said. And so we didn't think we had to contend with anybody, especially in our own region. And so we neglected North and South America. That was wrong because the Russians, the Iranians, and the Chinese filled vacuums. And now we're in a difficult situation today, not only south of our border, but also north of our border, where China has become extremely influential in Ottawa. The flood of Chinese migrants into the United States across both our southern and northern borders is really unprecedented. If we go back 2 or 3 years, we were seeing primarily family groups coming into the United States. In other words, lower and middle class Chinese who were desperate to live in a free society. Now, 2/3 of the Chinese migrants are single males of military age, traveling without family members, some of them pretending not to speak English. And Border Patrol has noticed that in some of these packs coming across, so they're coming across in packs between 4 and 15, that everybody in the pack has identical kit. That is an ominous sign.